Hello and welcome to another episode of Faith and Spirituality in a Time of Crisis. My name is Chris Fuller, and I am the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer at St. Joseph's College in Maine. The events of the last few weeks have reminded us that we are not free from the troubling history of race in America. And so for this episode, I have invited to the conversation the Reverend Ada Renée Williams. Reverend Williams is the Director of Anti-Racism and Racial Equality for the Sisters of Mercy Institute. She is also an anti-racism thought leader for faith communities and a sought-after preacher, teacher, and anti-racism trainer. She is a scholar activist who is an ordained itinerant elder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, serving as the Minister of Social Justice and Civic Engagement at Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore, Maryland. She holds a Master of Divinity from Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley, California, and certificates in Black Church, Africana Religious Studies, and Women's Studies and Religion from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, where she is currently a doctoral student in Womanist Ethics and Africana Religious Studies. She is the creator and curator of Womanist Wednesdays, a digital engagement, founder of the Pastoral Care Black Trauma Network, and a former board member of Carrie's Touch, an African-American breast cancer advocacy and education organization in Sacramento, California. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the term anti-racism. It's a term that's coming into more common use right now, in particular relative to the publication of the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I'm sure there are many who see the term and would like to say, well, I'm against racism, or I don't see color. So doesn't that make me an anti-racist? Yeah. And it seems to me they're not the same thing, correct? So what does anti-racism mean that someone like me might be missing?
Well, I think that
being against racism is enough.
Well, because I think before you can say you're an anti-racist, you need to understand what racism is. You know, okay. What is racism? Many of us want to jump to the conversation, I'm anti-racism, I'm against prejudice, but racism is not about feelings. And racism is an interlocking system of oppression, okay, that is designed to promote and maintain white supremacy. The notion that white people, including their bodies, their aesthetics, their beliefs, their values, their customs, and culture are inherently superior to all other races, and therefore should wield dominion, let's say, or dominance over the rest of creation, including other people and groups. And we have to understand that. A lot of people will say racism is simply, race prejudice plus power, and that's a very simplistic way of identifying racism. And I think that that's helpful, but racism is way more nuanced than that. And that you've got to understand the breadth of racism, and before you can say that you stand against it. And as if you're an anti-racist, it means that you're working diligently in every facet of your life to undo racism and how you also benefit from racism, and not just how it impacts a marginal group, but when you become an anti-racist, you're saying that even systems that benefit you, that you're willing to work against them to make them more equitable for every other person. And so people are like, so that's the difference there. And so I think that my concern in this time is that we have a lot of people who are going to perform as anti-racist. And the performativity of anti-racism is quite detrimental. Because if you are an anti-racist and that's what you're going to present to me on the cover, when I open the book, am I going to see that you actually have done the work and that the things are in place, that you have really worked for an equitable system, that people of color are in the high echelons of your leadership, that your syllabus reflects Black thinkers, that you live in a neighborhood that is not just exclusively white. Are you doing things? Do you support businesses of color? Do you stand up? Because many people think that because, like you're saying, I'm an anti-racist, I'm not prejudiced, that makes me anti-racist. It's way more, it requires more than that.
Certainly, I mean, so, the comfort for me to be able to say I'm against racism is very passive. right? I mean, from what I hear you saying is I can sit in my comfortable home, in my comfortable gated community, and say, oh, look what's happening is very terrible. I'm not one of them. Therefore, I'm against racism, so I must be on the good side of things. And what you're saying, it's a lot more than that. And interesting distinction I think I heard you say, which is, and we're not talking about the common language in this time often seems to be also reform. What I hear you saying is undo. And there's a difference between those two things, correct?
There's an absolute difference. And it's easy to assert, as I said, and perform anti-racism. I'm an anti-racist. What does that cost you? For many people, it doesn't cost them anything because they're not shifting anything in their lives, and somehow believe that the way that they have been living is enough. You know, that that they haven't ever. And I think it comes into one of those conversations between the good and the bad white people. You know, I'm not one of those white people that yell the racial epithets and hates, you know, say things out loud and all of that. I'm a good one. I'm not the bad one, so to speak. And as long as we keep looking at racism as good and bad, we can't undo the system that keeps it in place. Because there are a lot of well-meaning people who have been able to maintain white superiority in their organizations, in their communities, and in their neighborhoods. There are a lot of well-meaning people who sit at tables where they don't see any other people of color. There are a lot of well-meaning people who consistently say things like, like as you were saying, I've never said that. I would never say the N-word. I would never not be nice to a Black person. You know, those are well-meaning people, but that's not undoing the system. You're not challenging the system and the structure of what has kept it in place for centuries.
And let me share with you my own experience in that, which is my being on that side of the line, which is my own wife, who is Mexican. Early on when we were dating, and this reflects very much my suburban 70s white upbringing. We were dating, we were at SeaWorld years ago, 30 plus years ago. We were in the gift shop and my wife was looking at some clothing, and there were two young white girls not far from us looking elsewhere. And one started walking our way and the other one said, don't go over there, she touched it. And me at that time, 30 years ago, said to my wife, just let it go. Because to me, from my perspective, that was a one-off, right? But what I learned from her and from my relationship with her is that's not a one-off.
That's right.
And so again, wanting to believe that my dating a Mexican was enough, right? To show that I love people of color.
That's right.
Enough, right?
That somehow her proximity to your white privilege is going to keep her and protect her from the racism that sees her by the hue that she is when she walks through the door. Exactly.
Absolutely.
And it is not enough. And I think that sometimes people think that, you know, and the one-off, oh, let it go, it wasn't that big of a deal. Well, when you live in this society and you're a person of color, you get a dozen one-offs before you can get to your office in the morning. You can get a dozen one-offs, you know, that's just one, I let it go. You know, you can walk out of your house and walk down to the corner store and have several encounters before you can get back to your home. And so in anti-racism world, what we call that are the type of microaggressions, the little small cuts that happen all the time that, well, many white folks are like, oh, let it go. Don't make a big deal of it. And they build up, and they're little cuts, they're little slights. They're ways that institutions and individuals are able to impose racist attitudes and behaviors without looking or seeming racist. It happens in institutions all the time. Institutional structures, you will have people institutional structures which will oftentimes avoid including persons of color, unless it's, of course, it's very social. but when it comes to the decision making, they're not at the table. Or information and materials that should directly go to someone who is a person of color, who is the director of a department, instead of it's sent to the white person that they're more comfortable with, or it's just skipped that person altogether. But then when you are the person of color and you raise this type of overt exclusion from a process, then you are problematized, as opposed to the organization and the institution saying, hold it, we're not going to do this here. Because as soon as the organization sits silent on behavior like that, it continues to codify the institutional racism that is going on within the place. And so that's where institutions have to be willing. It's not enough to say we are anti-racist, we want an anti-racism director, we hire people of color. That's not enough. You have to be willing to call out the really ingrained way that people will continue to keep that system of exclusion going on. And if you're not willing to do that, then you are really just absolutely imposing again the type of racism that we're trying to undo.
And it seems to me that the two parts here, which are institutional and, as you said, calling on, right? I think what I'm hearing you say is to my own journey towards anti-racism. Also, part of my journey is being fortunate that people in my life, my wife and others, have called me out, right? Either persons of color or even on issues relating to gender, right? Have called me out. But it seems to me I can't rely on that as my journey towards anti-racism. I can't just have benchmarks along the way waiting for people who aren't me to call me out along the way, right? I've got to reach some point where I'm the one that's doing the calling out.
Absolutely, right? Because so many persons of white actually believe that the only way to become anti-racist is on the backs of the pains of the teachings of people of color. And you're absolutely correct. White folks have to learn how to be able to call themselves out without the expense of people of color. Again, in anti-racism, as an anti-racism educator, we talk about that as the emotional labor that white folks are always expecting from people of color. It's like for us to do your homework, like, okay, I went to the workshop, but I don't really get it. So can you help me again? Oh, did I do that wrong? Oh, I'm really sorry. Can you explain to me again why that was wrong? It's like doing homework. Like, okay, go do your own work. Yes, go to the training, but do your own work. It is really, and I think the other thing that you raise here, Chris, is that ingrained historical paradigm, where for people of white, it is not foreign for them to expect that the brown and black people are going to do their work for them, because that is the cultural narrative of this country. We've always done it. So they think like, well, there aren't any black people here, there aren't any brown people here, so we don't have a racism issue, and so we don't have to address it. In fact, you have to. That is how you undo the system, whether someone's at the table or not. I'm sure, we learn as that you can't undo the bias to LGBTQ and I communities just because someone may not be at the table. That's not how that happens. You don't undo bias to differently able people because they're not at the table. If you are connected and you are committed to being anti-racist, then you also have to look at the intersectionality of all these other isms that we need to simultaneously work against. And when we fail to do that, we fail to recognize someone's whole humanity. Because in other words, what institutions say, without saying it. When they don't move forward, what they're literally saying is, we don't want to disrupt our comfortable whiteness.
Absolutely. And even this conversation is making me think, right, that my own wife, whose father was a field hand in California, right, during the time of Cesar Chavez.
That's right.
I gained personal comfort in saying, you go, Cesar. I support the field workers. But then when I turn to my wife and I say, can you help me understand this better as a white person? In essence, put her in the same position.
As always being the teacher.
I've made her father. I've made her my field hand, if you will, metaphorically speaking, but I've done it nonetheless. even though I'd like to believe I'm well-intended in my own personal support for field workers in California.
That's right. And when we go back to the field workers in California and the Cesar Chavez and the stoop labor and what that means, and the type of marginalization to this day that farm laborers get, who are brown, mostly brown folk, who are out there doing the work. We're like, we want to understand this better, but we don't really want to understand it better. We want to talk about a reformation, but we know that we want our fresh vegetables and we want our fresh fruit, and we don't care what it's costing to get that. And so when you want all of those things, you have to recognize that there is a human person on the other end of that. And our failure to be able to see how the system of oppression impacts from the farm worker to the office worker and how that is all interconnected, then we are again failing humanity and institutions and structures. And I want to get back to the humanity piece because particularly in institutions, because when institutions say, and you work in higher ed, and so many times in higher ed, there is the apprehension to have that class because we don't have those students, or how do we attract those students? Or if those students come, the next thing they're like, well, maybe this isn't a good place for them. Maybe we weren't ready to have the students here. Again, that is a passive way of saying that my full humanity is not regarded in your school and in your institution. You're, in other words, telling me to wait, go stay in my place, stay outside of the door. Again, we don't want to disrupt the comfort of the whiteness of our institutions and of our schools with this brown and black body, because my presence is going to demand a change. It demands just by my mere existence. It means that, like, maybe the sexist jokes don't exist, but the racist ones that do exist, now that I'm there, that that's not okay. And so literally it is the disruption of the narrative. But again, by my presence, and the disruption comes because you're no longer able to pretend or perform anti-racism. There now is, I need to see what it is you're really doing.
So let's bring that conversation to higher ed. I work in an institution of higher ed, a Catholic institution of higher ed, in the state of Maine, in New England, very, very Anglo, white region. And I think to your point is sometimes we'd like to believe, well, this is the area we recruit from. It's just got a lot of white students. That's just what we end up with. So what does, in terms of this conversation, what does it look like to undo not reform, right, but undo the kind of structures that might be in place that we are yielding to, that perhaps we're unwilling to tackle? Like what does it look like to undo that so that we don't fall back passively on the excuse simply to say, well, it's just we're in a region with a lot of white people. That's kind of just as who we attract.
And because it's comfortable. I think that you just have to name it. I mean, first off, the region, if you're attracting people to the education and you can attract students of color from all over, they will come if you have something for them. But what's very difficult with PWI institutions is oftentimes they don't have faculty of color. They don't have support structures of color that help support students of color who are coming in. So it's not just that this is the region, it's that you're not willing to really change your ethos to be more inclusive. You're not willing to have the difficult conversations. You're not willing to even challenge in the whiteness, what if it is a predominantly white institution, as you're saying. So here's a prime example to take a look at what are the structures that we have in place and how has our whiteness created this kind of bastion for us that says that we don't have to deal with racism. We don't have to deal with any of those issues because, those are out there and we're here.
And to add further to that, right, we're not just an institute of higher learning, we're a Christian institution of higher learning. And let's bring this conversation then to, you and I both work for Christian organizations, right, and that are founded by the Sisters of Mercy. What do we need to be thinking of, not just generally as an institution of higher learning, but a Christian institution of higher learning? What does our being Christian bring to bear on this conversation? In what ways does it bring something to bear on the conversation, or do we need to be hearing something as Christians we've not been willing to hear or listen to?
I thought, wow, that's huge. Wow, that's huge. I think it's both and. I don't think it's an either or. I think both our faith has to help us interact better and have actions that are better. And our faith should be informing both our actions and our attitudes. But we also cannot divorce ourselves from the racist history of Christianity. And we have to also be able to acknowledge that and the segregation that has come from Christianity. And even now, in some sectors of Christianity, the way that type of racism is still being taught and pushed. So I think that those are some things we have to kind of grapple with. And I think that for us working in an organization of faith, I think part of that, I know for me, is my hope is that the faith will really, during my time here, that we can really honestly, genuinely look at love our brothers and sisters, love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Yeah, I think that's what I'm really thinking. Can we really do that? Can we not just perform it? Can that be reflected in our policies? Can that be reflected in our institutions? Can that be reflected in how we move? It's not enough that we may have a ministry in an area that is heavily populated by the impoverished and the brown and black folk, yet we get to go back to our safe enclave that is very white, that we may be down by the border and doing the work here, but we still go back to places that are very white, that are not having the difficult conversations. Because Chris, the most difficult conversations for white folks to have is in the intimacy of whiteness with other white folks. Okay, where other white folks name it and call out other white folks for the way that they are not, one, anti-racist, or they're failing to be anti-racist, but also for a way that the gospel, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, is not being manifested in the way that they are treating, speaking to, and moving with other persons of color. And for us as part of Mercy, in our organization, when we go in, even when we're doing a ministry or a charity, we have to always remember that we are still coming in as a position of power. I'm African American, but I still come into a such situation with that power. So you always have to be able, even as a Mercy representative, to remember how we need to move, that our interaction is, even for me, more important. Well, no, not more than. I would say equal to what we say. I really need for our rhetoric and our actions to fall in alignment.
And I think it's a very good point too, that it's very in terms of being willing to have those conversations about whiteness, is to recognize the ways in which we craft comfortable boundaries for ourselves, so that we might go to impoverished neighborhoods to serve people, right? And we come back, but also we watch movies like The Help, right? Which create this comfortable narrative of white people who help, African Americans, or white people who help Mexicans become better runners and state champions. This constant kind of Hollywood storytelling of the white savior. And so we can create this kind of boundary for ourselves where we go serve and we feel good about it because we serve impoverished nations, and we watch movies about impoverished people being served, and we are not being intentional enough to recognize the ways in which we're creating those comfortable boundaries for ourselves.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, we sit here in the aftermath of George Floyd being buried yesterday. And we sit here in the aftermath of the uprising that's been taking place. And you've seen them as well as I have, the number of statements that have come out and the enlightenment that people have gotten, and how upset it seems that so many people are about what occurred on that, what was that, May 25th in Minneapolis, and what they watched going on. Yet that was not the very first time that a Black person was killed unarmed by the police. Yet to see that this time, people are like, this is so horrible. And so my question is always, so what is it that has now connected this moment that has disconnected all the other moments, you know, and that it should not always be, it should not take folks the viewing of something so brutal as that to want to step up. It shouldn't take that. You know, I mean, we can go back. I look at George Floyd and I think about Emmett Till. I think about, why is this the cost? Why does Black America have to consistently bleed all the time for white America to recognize that we are human? And I wonder, how long will our humanity be seen? Because the truth is that this is going to fade from the headlines. And folks are going to go back to behaving in the ways that they've behaved before. Because if you're not committed to it and you're not committed to change, it'll take but a split second for people to forget and to begin the same old behavior again.
And you mentioned everything that's taking place right now, and it's taking place in the midst of a pandemic also. Yep. And I think, again, people from my perspective would like to comfortably separate those things. There was a pandemic going on, and then George Floyd was killed, and now there's protests.
Yeah.
But in fact, in light of this conversation, talking about examining systemic racism, they're actually interconnected, are they not?
They're very connected. Because when we got into the pandemic, we were looking at record numbers of persons of African Americans, Latinos, who were literally dying and have died because of the pandemic. And it just really heightened the type of racial inequities that go on in our healthcare system. So, you know, you sit here and I think that it was just right there in front of everyone's camera to see, like, these are the people who are dying from this. And it would then inform all of the different systemic issues that were happening in neighborhoods, happening in communities. But even with that narrative, there were quite a few people who wanted to say, well, those are poor Black people. Those are the poor, or those are the Black people who don't eat well. They weren't seeing that this was not saying, it was not just the impoverished Black folks who are being impacted by this. It was across the socioeconomic spectrum for persons of African descent as well as Latinos. And we were also ignoring how it was ravishing First Nation communities. So the pandemic, what it did was lift these racial inequities and how it lives out in the healthcare system. And then on top of that, you're able to see an absolute blatant violent inequity that is happening in broad daylight on the streets of Minneapolis, that a man is being killed before our eyes. And what was very different about it is that the officer, usually we get these video cameras and you can't really see the officer, you can't really make it out. You know, it's like one of the cameras that they're wearing on their uniform. But in this one, you had a young woman who stood there on the sidewalk and filmed as a white officer looked directly into the camera without any shame and continued to press his knee on his neck. You had the Asian officer, Officer Tao, who kind of was like hanging out. His attitude, there wasn't any alarm. And what people don't realize is that this was a 14-year-old girl who stood there to bear witness to the killing of this African American man who was walking her 9-year-old cousin to the corner store. Our children had to bear witness to a murder. And all we're talking about, for the most part, in all of these statements that are coming out, all of these articles that are being generated, is let's talk about white privilege. Let's talk about becoming anti-racism. What about the care and concern and the trauma that is happening to the Black community? Where are the trauma experts? Where is the care for the people who have to live with this day in and day out? Our babies witness a man die in front of their face. I do not think any white parent would ever want that for their babies. Yet it's supposed to be okay for mine.
Absolutely. And yesterday, in watching a conversation among some African-American leaders and talking about this very thing, again, the perspective they brought, which is not within my cultural background, but it added another layer to this, was someone who was the mayor of Atlanta from the South. He said, in the South, we know that position. That's the position that a hunter uses to lean on the neck of a deer that he has just shot.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, this is about being hunted.
That's right.
We know this from our experience. And so some people see an officer killing a black man by using force, which is one thing, but there's also this other perspective, which is to know what it's like to be hunted.
Not just to know what it's like to be hunted. It is, yes, it's to know what it's like to be hunted, but it is also a display, a visceral display, that after 400 years in this country, we do not have our full citizenship here. That we are not considered equal citizens, that is an okay and acceptable thing to do, that you could literally put down George Floyd as if he were your game, that you had just gone out with your buddies to hunt. And people want to sit here and say, well, literally, I remember a person saying to me, well, I wanted to find out more about George Floyd. What about him? What did he do up to that point? And that is from an enlightened white person who's articulating that, who doesn't see their racism. Like literally, it doesn't matter. His humanity was denied. His humanness was denied and on full display without any hesitancy from the officer. And that officer looked in that camera straight on. He didn't hide his face. And it was literally with an attitude of impunity. And I'm sure there's more shock on his end that he has been arrested than not.
Yeah. And it seems to me that implicit racism is present also in when people say, it's terrible what happened. I stand with the protesters, but why do they have to loot? Right? So first conflating the protesters with looting, but also changing the focus of the conversation. If only there wasn't the looting, I would care more.
Well, and let's face it, those are the same people who haven't been part of the movement anyway. So it doesn't matter if it is the looting or not. They are probably not people who have ever even uttered Black Lives Matter. Right, and understand what that means in the context of a political movement of this time and of our era. And I think what people have to remember is the history of policing and how policing began, how it was slave patrollers, and then it turned into police officers. But from the inception of policing, it has always been about protecting property. And that's how it has always been. And so when we get into this conversation about the looting and calling out the police, it is protect what has been valuable, which is property and not life. And so, I am someone who I'm not comfortable with violence. That is not a place of comfort for me. Yet I understand the philosophical reasoning behind some of the violence that is happening and some of the looting. But I think that here, and this is what I think is so ironic, is people are upset over the riots and the fires. But when you have when Alabama won, I believe it was, they pulled out a couch and burned it up in the street. So when different football teams win, they turn over cars, they have these big fires, and that is celebrated. When we go to another country and another country rises up against their totalitarian government, Saddam Hussein, when they topple the Saddam Hussein statue, that's liberation. Here, it is called violence. Here, it is called vandalism. Here, it is called, oh, how could you do this? When you have a group of people that are fighting to be full citizens, you have to understand that there is this, we are not ever going to receive our citizenship by asking nicely. We have done that and we haven't gotten it. So yes, I get why people get upset over that. I also understand what it means to property owners. And I think there was one property owner who I will always remember, and he is from India, and he saw his shop go up in flames, and he says, let it burn. That can be replaced. Life can never be replaced.
Thank you. That's, you know, I'll just end our conversation together then with, we've talked about the need for people like myself, other white people, to do their homework.
Yeah.
Right? Now it's incumbent upon us to do our homework. And I realize I'm almost even kind of playing into our early conversation by asking this, but it is, can you provide a useful starting point for people to do their homework? Where would I or someone start if they wanted to dig into this and start doing the homework we need to do on this issue?
Well, I think I think when we began the conversation, you named some very important resources. I absolutely love that you're linking to the 1619 Project. I think people need to begin there. People need to understand the history. They need to understand the history that built this nation. I think that's very important. And then after that, I would suggest that people read Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility. Mm-hmm. You know, I think those are two very easy starting points. Mm-hmm. But again, I go back to one of the places of white comfort is like, okay, I get all this knowledge. I'm not going to make a mistake. You have to, at some point, speak up. You have to speak up. You have to be able to interrupt the violence, because so often what white folks don't understand, like you were talking to your wife, the incident you shared about your wife, let it go. Those are acts of violence. Those are acts of violence. When we are in these conversations and white folks begin to say things, and even people of color who can also be very attacking to other people of color because they disagree or what have you, for whatever number of reasons, you have to be willing to interrupt that when you see the violence that is occurring, because that is violence and you have to be willing to stop it. Just like a lot of the protesters stopped people who wanted to go into a store or wanted to burn a building. They put their body between the looter or the rioter and the business. So my thing is that if my Black life really matters to you and you're in a meeting with me and I am being attacked or I am being harmed and you can't speak up for me there, then I don't really believe that my Black life matters to you, because you're not willing to interrupt it.
Then my bibliography on anti-racism doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah, your bibliography isn't important to me because you're not willing to speak up. And the other part is, it's not what you do when I'm present. And I think that that's one of the reasons why your institution with this homogeneity is so important. I shouldn't have to be present in your institution for you to do the right thing. If you really are desiring to become an anti-racist community, it's what you do when you don't have an audience to say, oh, yay, good white people. It's what you do when someone's not looking. I need for folks to step up, whether there's a person of color at the table or not. Because when we talk about it, as I said, this is a system. This is a system. We have to deal with the systematic oppression, the institutional oppression. We have to deal with the overarching arm of racism. And none of this is going to happen if it's not done in concert with other folks. And if it necessitates Black folks and brown folks being there to guide you, then that again is on our backs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Reverend Ada Renée Williams, thank you very much for making the time for this conversation. I appreciate it. Very helpful, very insightful. And it's my hope that what people will take from this is, yes, do your homework, but do more than your homework.
All right. Thank you, Chris. It was great.